Across the lattice of interstellar jurisdictions, the Galaxy Council gathered with the composure of an authority accustomed to obedience, charting outcomes on luminous tables while analysts projected unanimous alignment. They considered Earth an outlier that would yield once its options narrowed, a world energetic yet predictable, destined to bend beneath a directive presented as benevolent order. Committees refined language, wrapped coercion in careful diplomacy, and prepared a declaration promising stability through supervision. Conditions demanded the dismantling of autonomous defenses, the absorption of human fleets into council command structures, and the appointment of external administrators who would verify compliance across every orbital tier. The transmission was routed through formal channels to ensure spectacle, accompanied by commentary across member worlds that framed the moment as inevitable alignment with galactic norms. Observers anticipated a reluctant reply, perhaps anxious debate, yet ultimately a concession. Instead, a single message arrived without preamble, stripped of ceremony, spoken in a tone neither hostile nor deferential. The representative did not submit arguments, did not negotiate parameters, did not solicit time. The statement carried only certainty: Earth declined the mandate. No emphasis, no flourish, only a refusal delivered with unwavering calm that unsettled the chamber more than any threat could have done. Debate ignited behind closed analytics, but the narrative presented outward remained confident. Models interpreted the reply as symbolic defiance before expected compliance. Commentators reassured audiences that disciplined pressure would shape the outcome. The Council scheduled a public vote to reinforce authority, projecting unity while preparing secondary measures designed to demonstrate consequence without escalation. Throughout the preparations, Earth maintained silence, offering neither explanation nor apology. Delegates assembled in the broadcast amphitheater beneath towering arrays of recorders, confident that the process itself would communicate inevitability. They rehearsed the announcement, arranged translations across thousands of relay networks, and organized commentary that would narrate Earth's realignment as a prudent decision guided by mature oversight. The tone balanced courtesy with supremacy, positioning the directive as a gift extended toward a civilization portrayed as inexperienced and impulsive. Across distant colonies, citizens watched the build-up as a ceremonial correction, the latest iteration of authority shaping an outlier into compliance. Diplomats prepared congratulatory responses in advance, eager to praise peaceful integration and reinforce their proximity to the center of power. Analysts, however, noted an absence difficult to categorize: no appeals, no protests, no rhetoric from Earth's side, only an enduring quiet that resisted interpretation. Within the Council, this quiet reinforced confidence rather than caution. Silence was read as hesitation, hesitation as progress, progress as proof that the directive functioned as intended. Strategic planners finalized the vote schedule, calibrated ceremonial lighting, and prepared archival inscriptions celebrating collective resolve. Their certainty formed a surface of polished glass, impressive, reflective, and fragile, unable to acknowledge that beneath the calm message lay intent beyond their models. The appointed hour arrived with gravity worthy of empire. Spectators across countless constellations awaited the moment when the declaration would be read aloud and the world in question would enter supervision. Yet the chamber received no further voice from Earth, only the echo of the earlier refusal lingering in memory like a line drawn with absolute clarity. It was then that unease, thin but undeniable, touched the edges of confidence. Officials preserved composure, ratified the vote, and affirmed the mandate with ceremonial signatures that glowed across the theater. They believed the act concluded the exchange, a decisive gesture sealing authority. What none of them recognized in that moment was how thoroughly the balance of power had shifted the instant the refusal was spoken, not through volume or threat, but through a certainty that granted no opening for control. Before celebrations could ripple outward, quiet observers across the network began to question the premise behind the vote, sensing that the absence of resistance signified preparation, and that the world presumed compliant had answered in full long before the mandate was proclaimed to them all. Across the archives of the Council, analysts reopened restricted dossiers that had been filed away when the vote was planned, tracing the long curve of human history through fragmented recordings, ethnographic summaries, and expedition reports that earlier committees had dismissed as atmospheric context rather than strategic data. What emerged was a pattern that unsettled the few researchers who read past the executive digests. Humanity's development did not follow the steady ascents observed across most member species. Their epochs were punctuated by shock, collapse, scarcity, and recovery, each downturn followed not by fragmentation but by consolidation, innovation, and cultural reorganization that treated hardship as instruction rather than interruption. Civilizations that had flourished under stable skies found the pattern difficult to model, because resilience of that kind did not scale with population or technology. It seemed to grow from memory, myth, and an ingrained expectation that adversity would return and must be met with structure rather than fear. Economists noted that human institutions evolved redundancies instead of dependencies, distributing authority across overlapping systems that could continue to function even when others failed. Military archivists observed that their doctrines avoided heroic concentration and favored autonomous coordination, enabling small commands to act decisively without waiting for permission when communications collapsed. Sociologists highlighted records of recovery in which devastated regions rebuilt faster than external aid arrived, guided by communal frameworks that prioritized continuity of knowledge over preservation of status. None of these indicators suggested aggression, yet together they formed a capability that empires found difficult to confront, a refusal to break. Colonial observers had circulated rumors describing humans as dangerous because they survived circumstances that would have ended other civilizations. The Council categorized those reports as exaggerations produced by frontier anxiety, yet the numbers within the attachments persisted. Where other species required centuries to regain capacity after planetary crisis, humans recovered within decades, having already designed mechanisms that captured lessons from catastrophe and transformed them into policy, architecture, infrastructure, and discipline. Their institutions retained the record of past failures with deliberate clarity, teaching each generation that prosperity was provisional and must be defended by preparedness rather than conquest. To the analysts who read deeply, that philosophy explained why Earth maintained autonomous defenses without expanding outward. They were not assembled to dominate, but to prevent history from repeating at a greater scale. Psychological briefings warned that the Council's approach relied on assumptions incompatible with this worldview. Pressure that might coerce a culture shaped by comfort could instead strengthen a society accustomed to strain. Silence, interpreted as hesitation within the chamber, aligned more closely with deliberation and unity across Earth's networks, where public debate was treated as internal work rather than a signal to rivals. The refusal, short and final, reflected a tradition in which acceptance of responsibility outweighed fear of consequence. Yet these findings never reached decision-making levels. They were compressed into abstracts, then condensed again into a single sentence that minimized risk and reassured leaders that humanity's resilience signified adaptability rather than resolve. Across the outer systems, historians compared the directive with earlier attempts to govern emergent powers and found the parallel troubling. Those precedents ended poorly whenever authority underestimated communities that viewed survival as a civic obligation. The Council overlooked the distinction. They believed stability was something imposed from above. Humans believed stability was something constructed from within, reinforced by painful memory that could not be negotiated away. That difference, nearly invisible to those who had never experienced collapse, was the axis on which the crisis would turn. By the time the vote concluded, the last researchers who still traced the archived warnings understood that the message Earth had delivered was not defiance for its own sake, but the expression of a species that had already measured the cost of submission and found it incompatible with the lessons that had carried them through every disaster they had endured. They would not surrender that memory. After the refusal settled into the networks of power, committee strategists translated uncertainty into procedure, drafting an ultimatum that compressed authority into measurable steps. They framed it as correction, not punishment, yet every clause signaled consequence. Deadlines fixed compliance, auditors were assigned oversight, and a demonstration strike was authorized as proof that resistance carried weight. Public commentary reduced the language to spectacle, promising discipline without disruption, while private memoranda forecast submission once pressure crystallized. Across member worlds, observers anticipated a negotiation that ended before it began. Earth replied with nothing further. The silence became the final variable, treated in models as delay rather than intention. The Council converted the projection into action and authorized deployment. Fleets maneuvered to defined coordinates, their presence framed as reassurance to the wider polity. Crews rehearsed limited operations designed to disable infrastructure without inflicting irreversible harm. Directors described the plan as precise, humane, and temporary, a signal rather than a campaign. During the final countdown, instruments reported conditions so stable that commanders felt affirmed. No interdiction fields, no decoy deployments, no electronic haze. The planet presented as unguarded, its orbits quiet, its channels open yet unused. Analysts interpreted the emptiness as exhaustion, the last stage of capitulation. In truth, the absence was deliberate, but that meaning escaped their frameworks. Broadcast relays stitched every perspective into one synchrony so the directive could become history in real time. Commentators prepared conclusions before events occurred, speaking about unity, predictability, and the value of orderly integration. Within the chamber, signatures validated authorization and timers advanced with ceremonial precision. Every indicator suggested the outcome already secured, reducing the remaining seconds to formality. Then the certainty thinned. Navigation boards noted infinitesimal drift in reference anchors, not enough to threaten alignment yet sufficient to unsettle veteran officers who trusted patterns more than rhetoric. Diagnostic routines cycled for reassurance and returned flawless readings, reinforcing the narrative of control. The hesitation lasted only a breath, forgotten as systems resumed their rhythm. Orders moved through encrypted conduits toward the units tasked with demonstration. At that instant, a brief stillness crossed every command surface, subtle enough to resemble latency yet absolute in effect. Interfaces accepted inputs without translating them into execution. Voice relays carried acknowledgments that no circuit enacted. Logs displayed continuity, but continuity no longer meant control. Observers outside the hierarchy sensed the change before officials named it. Nothing exploded, nothing flared, and yet the choreography dissolved. Ships held position by inertia rather than command, and the networks that once synchronized authority became a lattice of isolated points. In the quiet that followed, it became clear that escalation had crossed a boundary invisible to those who believed power resided in signatures and ceremony. The outcome they assumed inevitable no longer existed, replaced by a truth that none of their instruments had been designed to measure. For leaders within the chamber, the interruption resembled silence rather than defeat, an absence that offered no adversary to confront and no narrative to claim. Reports cascaded upward with identical phrasing, confirming functionality while acknowledging impossibility. Protocols demanded escalation, yet escalation required mechanisms that no longer recognized direction. The machinery of consequence remained intact, but intention could not reach it. Across the wider polity, commentators faltered mid-sentence, confronted by images that showed nothing changing and yet everything altered. Audiences sensed that authority had passed through an unseen threshold from which it would not return. Without warning or spectacle, the directive ceased to exist as an enforceable reality, leaving its authors staring at instruments that reflected their signatures back at them like an unanswerable question. The countdown continued to tick in ceremonial displays, yet no path remained by which it could arrive at consequence. In that suspended interval, the purpose of the ultimatum inverted, revealing not the vulnerability of Earth, but the fragility of an order that had mistaken compliance for foundation and discovered, too late, that nothing solid waited. Authority unraveled without noise, and those who had trusted procedure discovered that control had depended on threads already severed long before the ultimatum was written. The Council's infrastructure had been built for reach, not resilience, layered across commercial exchanges, legal registries, logistics corridors, and adjudication engines that assumed uninterrupted continuity. When the stillness settled, these frameworks did not fail, they simply ceased to recognize a center. Certification keys no longer authenticated, lineage chains no longer confirmed precedents, and every directive dissolved into an ensigned abstraction. The fleets remained intact, stations remained powered, Yet none of them could act as an extension of governance because the identity of governance had vanished at the level of definition. Engineers searched for intrusion and found none. What they traced instead were dormant contingencies embedded within their own protocols, safeguards they had inherited from earlier eras and never fully mapped, safeguards that now resolved toward a different authority than the one proclaiming itself above Earth. Across archives, auditors located the hinge, a generation of cooperative standards authored decades earlier, when Earth participated in quiet technical exchanges rather than political negotiations. Those standards emphasized mutual verification, distributed custody of records, and a rule that no institution should claim legitimacy without demonstrating stewardship rather than dominance. The Council had adopted the protocols for efficiency, confident that centralization would always outweigh the subtleties of trust. During the vote, those same protocols evaluated the mandate and found that it contradicted the guarantees upon which the network rested. The result was not sabotage but rejection, an automated preservation of integrity that removed credentials from any office attempting to rule by coercion. Within 47 measured seconds, authority reverted to local custodians across thousands of jurisdictions, each one sovereign by default until voluntary alignment could be proven anew. Human observers did not broadcast triumph. They issued no commands, offered no demands, and advanced no fleet beyond their own orbit. Their systems had merely insisted that the Foundation's promise to every participant be honored in fact, not performance. Where others sought to reassert hierarchy, Earth supplied documentation that explained the behavior of the network and accompanied it with restoration tools that allowed each world to stabilize services without dependence on a distant capital. Trade continued because communities chose to maintain it. Law continued where neighbors agreed to recognize one another. Everything else fell silent, not through destruction, but because nothing within the architecture could justify obedience to signatures that contradicted the conditions of shared responsibility. In the chamber, the absence of an adversary forced a reckoning more complete than defeat. Officials confronted instruments that recorded continuity without compliance, legitimacy without rulers, order without empire. The realization spread that power had never resided in ceremony or fleets. It had resided in the trust of countless partners who had consented to coordination so long as coordination respected their dignity. Once that condition failed, the system did exactly what it was designed to do: protect the members from the institution rather than the institution from the members. What remained of the Council existed as memory and architecture, a hollow structure incapable of imposing consequence because the moral argument that once animated it had evaporated. Across the polity, silence replaced commentary. Worlds that had expected punishment found themselves unburdened by supervision, faced not with occupation but with choice. Some reached out to Earth for guidance and received frameworks, not authority. Others withdrew inward to examine their own histories. The lesson spread quietly: stability cannot be extracted, only cultivated, and any power that forgets this truth dissolves the moment it attempts to command by fear. In the wake of that minute, the galaxy did not witness conquest. It witnessed a measure of responsibility so precise that tyranny could not survive within it. Its echo endured as proof that strength grounded in restraint can unmake empires and leave space for worlds to define their futures without fear or coercion. Across the weeks that followed, the dissolution of centralized rule unfolded not as crisis but as revelation, because every world learned how much of its strength had always lived in institutions that kept working when permission disappeared, and in agreements between neighbors who valued continuity more than spectacle. Rebuilding coordination through consent rather than command while treating the Council as caution instead of an anchor. Trade networks resumed through voluntary compacts, drawn up by merchants and engineers who documented every route and shared the record publicly, creating transparency where secrecy had once justified authority, and proving that prosperity flowed most reliably when participants chose it. Because each contribution became an affirmation that order could be generated from trust rather than extracted by decree across communities large and small everywhere alike. Scholars compiled reflections from newly autonomous regions, noting that independence had not produced isolation. Instead, cooperation deepened because every agreement required explanation, and explanation fostered understanding, turning policy into shared learning while replacing fear with accountability. so that the memory of near coercion stayed present as guidance rather than grievance. A reminder that durable peace depends on participation and cannot be delivered by force alone. Earth answered inquiries with brevity, offering frameworks for conflict resolution, templates for transparent budgeting, and open technical libraries that describe the verification protocols now governing the network, declining to claim ownership of outcomes while insisting that every world retained the right to withdraw consent. Because within that right lived the discipline that prevented power from hardening into domination and preserved dignity for future generations everywhere. Commentators across distant systems described the transition as the quietest upheaval in recorded politics, because institutions that once seemed immovable were replaced without violence by structures grounded in responsibility, and the example reshaped strategy academies, which began teaching that deterrence without empathy invites ruin, whereas restraint coupled with readiness allows communities to defend themselves without repeating the cycles that once scarred entire civilizations for good. Families who had lived under mandates for generations reported a new steadiness in daily life, not because prosperity surged instantly but because decisions now traveled horizontally through councils chosen by the people they served, and each policy carried signatures that reflected consent rather than compulsion, giving communities a language for disagreement that strengthened unity instead of breaking it through patience, adaptation, memory, and shared hope. Meanwhile, former council officials who remained in public life began addressing the past with candor, acknowledging how easily certainty had turned into presumption, and how the architecture they trusted had ultimately protected the galaxy from their own mistakes, a truth that transformed remorse into service as they helped rebuild governance on foundations that could withstand ambition without suppressing difference across cultures, borders, memories, and time. Students studying this turning point wrote that humanity's influence did not arise from dominance or wealth, but from an ethic that treated strength as stewardship, proving that a civilization becomes formidable when it refuses to abandon responsibility even when threatened, and when it measures victory not by submission gained but by the freedom it leaves intact for others to determine their own direction with gratitude thereafter. In time, a new constellation of councils emerged by invitation, each limited by charter and reviewed by the communities that composed it, and observers recognized that the disappearance of empire had not diminished cooperation, it had purified it, so that participation meant commitment rather than obedience, and service meant accountability rather than privilege, safeguarding the network against any future attempt to impose rule through fear. The memory of that decisive minute endured not as legend but as instruction, reminding every generation that peace thrives when power accepts limits and when communities invest in one another freely, and it echoed across the stars as evidence that the refusal to dominate can be the greatest act of courage a species performs in defense of its ideals and the stability of the galaxy.